Let's see if I remember my line. What is it? Oh yeah, welcome home. It's good to see you all today. For those of you joining us online, whether now or later, we like to think of this place as home, and by that we just mean a place where you can explore your own relationship with the divine, with God, however you understand God. And what we promote is the concept of love, that God is love, and that God demonstrated that love in so many ways, but among them sending Christ for us. And so when we say welcome home, that's kind of what we mean. So good morning, and welcome home. Today I want to talk about miracles. We see them throughout the Gospels and then even beyond in Acts. And of course there's all this theological and some of the monkey mucks discussions over whether miracles are still a thing, whether, all of that. I'm not going to go that route. Among the miracles in the Gospels attributed to Christ, one is listed in all four Gospels, and they're actually duplicates. It's when Jesus fed the 5,000 or the 10,000. And the scripture I'm going to use today is from the Message, and it's John's version of it, starting in John 6. It says, after this, Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee. Some call it Tiberias. A huge crowd followed him, attracted by the miracles they had seen him do among the sick. When he got to the other side, he climbed a hill and sat down, surrounded by his disciples. It was nearly time for the feast of Passover, kept annually by the Jews. When Jesus looked out and saw that a large crowd had arrived, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy bread to feed these people?" It's a setup. He said this to stretch Philip's faith. He already knew what he was going to do. Philip answered, 200 silver pieces wouldn't be enough to buy bread for each piece and to get a piece. One of the disciples, it was Andrew, brother to Simon Peter, said, "There's a little boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. That's a drop in the bucket for a crowd like this." Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There was a nice carpet of green grass in this place. They sat down, about 5,000 of them. Then Jesus took the bread, and having given thanks, gave it to those who were seated. He did the same with the fish. All ate as much as they wanted. When the people had eaten their fill, he said to his disciples, "Gather the leftovers so nothing is wasted." They went to work and filled 12 large baskets with leftovers from the 5 barley loaves. So many of us know this miracle about how Jesus took that. But I'm actually not going to talk about Jesus' role that much. I want to go back a little bit. I want to talk about, just back in that same passage. I'm actually not going to give him the context and all that today, so lucky you. We're just happy. But I'm going to go back to Jesus saying, hey, how are we going to feed these folks? And remember, Philip and Andrew, these are the ones closest to him, were like, there's no way. But even then, Andrew was like, well, there's this kid who has some bread and some fish, but... And I like the Message version where he said, that's just a drop in the bucket. That's not going to help anyone. It's just one drop. But that drop in the bucket is what I want to talk about today. You see, throughout the scriptures, especially the Gospels, Jesus, even in many, not sometimes Jesus just walks up and heals someone, and that's a miracle, and that's cool. But so many times, and even now, he uses the things around him, the people around him. How did they get the 5 loaves and 2 fishes that Jesus miraculously multiplied? There was a kid willing to share. This boy. Now, I don't know if a boy meant 6 or 16 or 20, I don't know. I'm guessing probably, 12-ish. Old enough to just kind of be there, and not necessarily under his parents' wing or make them being the decision maker, so 12, 13-ish maybe. But still, you had this kid going, yeah, I'll share. knowing that there's this throne, and when all the grown-ups were like, what's it going to matter? But someone contributed that drop in the bucket. And with Jesus, it helped feed 5,000 people. The other passages about feeding the 10,000 are similar. Someone had a little. The story, even the Old Testament stories about the widow's oil, when she would give it out, it would never run out. Those are all miraculous and in God's hands to take care of the miracle part. But it took people being willing to share what they have, being willing to share their gifts. It's so amazing. I didn't plan on today Heather being here and sharing her awesome gift of music. But it's perfect for this sermon. And it's awesome regardless, but those things that we have that maybe we take for granted our own gifts. Or maybe we think it's not big enough. How many times do I watch the news and go, what's the point? I can't change anything. And I can't on a big scale. And maybe that's why I'm less about the marching and more about just kind of helping where I can. Now the marching is good, there's benefit, it's all needed, don't get me wrong. But we all have different aspects to share. So you see, we sometimes get caught up in feeling that we must do big things in order to be considered impactful, or in order to be considered a ministry or something like that. You have to have a title, or you have to have a building, or you have to have this something behind you. And some people do have names that are easily recognized, and some people do great things with that, and that's awesome, and that's good. But God doesn't ask us for a Billy Graham or bust mentality. That's not what God calls us to be. He just wants us. We are the miracles. We are the facilitators of God's miracles. We are the builders of faith. We are the conduits, and that's all God asks us to be. And we can do those. And this has been the coolest part in the last few years. We can do that stuff by being ourselves. Yes, God always has stuff to work on. Yes, there are flaws I want to do better. But I spent a long time being afraid to be myself, because I was like, oh, God doesn't want someone snarky and a smart aleck and this and that, and I need to be, I could never be a pastor. I've got to be holy, and I've got to do this, and I've got to get a degree in theology, and for some people that's what they're called to do, and that's fine. But God spent a lot of time dealing with me about that and going, that's not what I asked you to be. I'm asking you to be the best Jenny you can be. And thankfully no one else has to be me. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus healed a man who was lowered through a roof. That's not in there. He healed a man who was lowered through a roof by 4 friends. 4 friends facilitated a miracle that Jesus did. Those 4 friends, maybe they had tried before saying, be healed in the name of God. Maybe they had practiced, maybe they hadn't. But they didn't just go, oh, who heals? Jesus does, and point. They were like, who heals? Jesus does. Let's go together. And when they couldn't get in, they were like, oh, there's a way. Now, I don't know about the vandalism part of that, but we'll let God take care of that. In the first recorded miracle of Jesus, in Matthew, the wedding, Jesus turns water to wine. But he starts, after saying, no, it's not my time, he starts by telling the servants to fill these jars. And they did. See, people contribute to all of this. A servant is healed by Christ, being facilitated by a Roman centurion, the master, who was not a Jew, not a follower, but understood authority. After seeing another miracle. And hearing about the miracles. See, we all contribute. And we contribute by seeing others' contributions. In these and several other illustrations, Christ shows us the model of our roles on earth now. Yeah, we talk about, we are the hands and the feet and the eyes. We can't all be the same, blah, blah. And that's cool. But this is reality. That's the truth. That it doesn't take In all of these instances and others, the common factor isn't social standing or even prominence within Christ's inner circle. These weren't the 12. These weren't his BFFs. Although they did miracles too, and that, I'm not downplaying their roles too. But it wasn't money, it wasn't race, it wasn't anything but willingness. The common factor is willingness. I'm not even going to say obedience, because obedience sometimes can be wrong. I think I'm obedient when maybe I'm not, but I'm trying to be willing. I'm trying to be willing to serve as vessels of God's love. Vessels have no desires for their own agendas. I'm not saying that in a bad thing, like, how dare you want anything? If we're being true vessels, that whole seek ye first the kingdom. We've talked about that before. That's what we want, because we have trust that that's what's the best for us, too. Not as some martyr, like, I will sacrifice for the kingdom. But no, I want the kingdom because that's what's best for me, too. And that's the Jeremiah 29:11, and that's what Carl was preaching about last week. We simply carry those miracles of the Creator. But the vessels can only hold so much at once. And we're all flawed. We can lose our willingness to share our gifts. We can, out of fear that we're going to run out of our own blessings, out of fear that oftentimes these mountaintop experiences, when we witness the miracles and all that, sometimes that leads to complacency, where we're like, ooh, I want to cling to this as long as possible, and if I spend too much energy sharing it, I might lose it. See, we try to take those vessels and say, I'm so willing, Lord, but then once we think we've got what we need, we try to put a cap on them. But these are leaky, flawed vessels. Maybe we're afraid of rejection. Maybe just the chips and cracks of life cause our desire to just suck in and hold all we can. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 says, for God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. That's us. We are called to shine. And the very next verse says, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not us. It doesn't mean we're meaningless. Jars of clay are important. We carry this. We can't just demean our own thing and say, I'm just going to stay here. God will do it without me. Yes, God can do it without you. But God doesn't want us to lose out as well. See, clay, as we all know from living in Oklahoma, has its strengths and its weaknesses. It definitely can crack, crumble, and break and shift and do all those things. And it can also be strong. So if we decide to apply ourselves as these clay vessels, we also have to accept what comes with that. The shiftiness, how leaky we can be. And because of that, we need to not try to cap that off for ourselves, but do the opposite. Because if we're trying to store God's powerful love for ourselves and hoard it, instead what's going to happen is, some still going to leak out and do what it needs to do. Because we're talking about God here. And it's also going to start breaking us down from the inside. It's going to turn stagnant. And what God means for blessing can become almost poisonous. Not only that, but if we're capping it off, then God can't refill it. See, we're trying to do it on our own. But we're also given these concepts. Like manna in Exodus, we're reminded that God will provide for our needs. God does allow us to store up what we need. He doesn't expect us to let ourselves just run dry. He provides for self-care. He provides for all that. He illustrates this in the life of Jesus, who often took time away from the crowds and others to spend time recharging. In fact, Matthew's account of one of those miraculous feedings occurs just after Jesus snuck away to process the news about John the Baptist's beheading. But for the most part, God chooses to allow us to participate as a way to, yes, help others, but also help us learn, thank you, Brandon, also help us learn to rely on God, to remember who the author and perfecter of our souls is. And it's not an ego thing with God. Ego is like a fill-in. God doesn't need a fill-in. God just is. Kind of like the saying in sports, it ain't bragging if it's true. God doesn't have to be insecure. God doesn't need us, but God chooses to need us so that we can learn and build the faith that we need for our own stuff. He chooses to include us with all our differences, with our individuality, and that to me is just the coolest. In the big and small miracles of life every single day. We can hide our light. We can try to hoard our manna, or whatever metaphor works, but that only creates darkness, or with the manna it created maggots. It creates stagnation. It doesn't fulfill God's purpose. Instead, as we all know, we're called to share our life. And by sharing, we can refill even more. We're called to share our gifts, whatever they are. To share that living water that is good news of Christ in whichever way suits us and fits us. And continue to refill instead of resenting that we're leaky and chipped and all that. Instead, we can turn and go, God, I need more. God, I need a refill. God, I need a refill. And that's the cool part about it. We don't have to resent how we were made. We don't have to wish that we were a different vessel or that we had different gifts. We work with the gifts we have and build them. And yes, we work through the things that don't show God's love. But we were never taught, we were never called to compare and hoard and try to outdo one another. We're just called to share. Revelation 22. I know I'm going to Revelation. Can you imagine? Revelation 22, verses 1 and 2 says, Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. We can tap into that tree. That's not an apocalyptic thing. That's heaven. That's God's providing that tree of life. And we can tap into those flowing waters. And we can be a tributary and carry it to others who don't experience that, who have known nothing but rejection and pain. And yes, we can relate to that. But we can also go deeper to the healing that God can provide. Right? Keeping a lid on that vessel doesn't work. So just blow it off. Go topless. So your vessel, your soul can be refilled continuously. Because no matter how hard you try to keep it to yourself, it'll still leak out. But part of it will also stagnate and poison you. Don't try to save everyone. Just share your gifts. Sometimes it's a struggle, but sometimes it isn't. And that's both the frustration and the beauty of life with God. And not if, but when it's tough. I try to remind myself of Romans 8:28. It works both directions. As we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to God's purpose. That not only helps us see that when we experience heartache and pain, God can turn it around, and will, and does, but it also sees that we can help that for others. We are the all things.